Thank you, Chairman. Thank all of you for being here. I had a question about small businesses, and small businesses obviously are responsible. I happen to be married to a small business owner, but for nearly 2/3 of job growth in this country. And I think the challenges for regulations become even greater with small businesses. Their ability to move forward right now with 3,000 regulations currently in the works. Just even as a small business owner, knowing what those regulations are and how to apply them seems to me to be a big challenge in terms of wanting us to allow small businesses to drive growth. And I was wondering how, Minister Clement, how Canada has been successful at reducing the regulatory burden, particularly on the smaller businesses. And I would also, ask Ms. Dudley as well, that as while you were OMB administrator, what do you think in terms of dealing with small businesses that would be more effective? Minister Clement.
Thank you, Senator. It's an honor to be here and to respond to your concerns. I've been mostly focusing my remarks on what we call the one-for-one rule for new regulations being put into place. An equal number or a larger number of regulations in terms of the administrative burden have to be removed from the books, so the net impact on small business is either neutral or positive. And so that's been the focus of a legislative package that I had passed through Parliament earlier this year. We also do things which I understand from the testimony are done here as well, forward regulatory plans, so that each regulating department or agency has to project 2 years into the future and say, and publish, here's what we plan to do, here's what we think the impact on small business is going to be. Small business, what do you say? Is this something that you can meet, or should we be changing our plans in some way to meet the public policy goal without creating the burden, and starting that dialogue early.
So 2 years in advance.
2 years in advance, 24 months in advance. The other thing that we do was add what we call a small business lens to every regulatory package. I'm president of something called the Treasury Board. We mostly cut budgets, but we also deal with regulations. And so when a regulatory proposal is put before us by a minister or by an agency or by a department, they have to include within that package of information the likely impact on small business in particular. And the reason that that is important is because what I've noticed over time is that, quite frankly, the public service have a lot of, they've got a lot of knowledge and a lot of experience. Not many of them have been involved in small business. That hasn't been part of where they have come from or what they have learned or so forth. So to force them to actually have the dialogue with small business, say, how will this affect you, and then include that in the package, means that me as a decision maker, an elected politician, a cabinet minister, I am now aware of some of the costs associated with that reform package, that regulatory package to small business, and that makes me more sensitized to that impact.
Mm-hmm. I didn't know if anyone wanted to add anything to that.
Yeah, I can just talk a little bit about how it's done in the U.S. So OIRA, you had asked what OMB's responsibility is. OMB is responsible for looking at small business impacts, working with the Small Business Office of Advocacy. And they both have statutory responsibilities under the Regulatory Flexibility Act and the Small Business Regulatory Enforcement Fairness Act. And some agencies actually, OSHA, EPA, and the Consumer Financial Protection Board have to have earlier advance notice and evaluation of the rules. Another thing...
And sorry to interrupt you, that's, as I understand it, that's because there's the Regulatory Flexibility Act allows that. I actually have a bill to expand that across all agencies.
Yes, it was kind of started as a pilot, but yes, it might be appropriate to expand it across agencies. Now, also the Reg Flex Act requires, under Section 610, requires agencies to look at the economic impact of their regulations on small businesses retrospectively every 10 years. They're supposed to evaluate whether there are ways to do that that's better for small businesses. That has not been effective. It just hasn't been effective, which is why I think some of the incentives that you all are talking about here could make that more, it would provide incentives to really look back. I mean, as you said, looking back alone, you didn't change the culture until you added the incentive of the one-for-one.
How do we deal with this issue of cost-benefit analysis, cost impact? Because one of the feedbacks I get, particularly from smaller businesses, is that you can imagine that in a smaller business, you don't have an army of lawyers and accountants, and frankly, big business has an ability to comply with regulations in a way that small businesses don't, because they just don't have the personnel and people focusing on this. And I think sometimes as I look at how the government does this cost-benefit analysis, it doesn't really truly take into the cost and the viability, especially on smaller entities. How can we improve that piece of it? Anyone who'd like to weigh in is.
As Professor Dudley described, we do a lot of that now. There are 2 statutes that require that. It is the responsibility, as I recall, of OIRA to administer those statutes. And when you look at agency rules, many, in fact, I'm pretty confident the vast majority have exceptions for small businesses. Now, there are a lot of problems with that, because what happens a lot is that large businesses then try to game the system. And all of a sudden you discover that a large corporation has created 50 small businesses that they then so it's actually quite difficult to try and figure out what businesses are subject to these exemptions, and you have to assume that there'll be a lot of gaming of any exemptions by big business to get the advantages of the exemptions for small businesses. But we have a process now that applies to all of that, and it's required by law.
Well, my experience from hearing from folks on the ground is that that process isn't fully effective, and almost like this idea that the people who are reviewing it and doing the cost-benefit analysis, they don't think about what it would take to be in this small business and do some of the things we're asking people to do. That's just feedback I hear from the ground. And, you know, I mean, I helped my husband build his small business, so I know how hard our small business owners are working just to survive every day.
Senator, one of the things we do in Canada is this standard cost model, where we actually involve the small business representatives in calculating the cost of the new proposed regulation on small business. How many hours does it take to comply? How long do they have to sit in their office filling out the forms? What is the opportunity cost of that, as opposed to going out and creating wealth and working on their business? So we actually created a formula based on an international practice to measure that cost of compliance. But it's not just, you know, somebody in Ottawa in some office somewhere applying the formula. They've actually got to talk to the small business stakeholders to make sure the formula is being applied in the particular case of the proposed regulation in an appropriate manner.
Great, thank you.
Professor Dudley, did you want to respond to Senator Ayotte? It looked like you might have.
Thank you very much. Yeah, just one more point on that is that often the costs that really affect the small businesses, especially the innovators, they're not direct costs. They're hard to measure. And so if you're innovating a new, have some new ideas, you really cannot bring them to market without just selling your ideas to a larger company. So I think part of the problem is that those costs are just hard to measure.
Thank you, Professor
But they're
Dudley.
real.